Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Professor Michael Brünig. I'm the Dean and Head of School of UQ Business School. First and foremost, I acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. On behalf of UQ, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connection to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. And here locally, these are the Yagara and Turrbal people. Thank you for joining us this afternoon at our Thought Leadership webinar, where we will be discussing leading during times of crisis. And an obvious topic, one could say, and a really interesting topic. I remember years ago, I heard a leadership talk about the board members of Malaysian Airlines and their reaction after they lost their second plane. A very distinct crisis that a team would have to work through that requires distinct leadership. And over the last 2 days, I thought about two incidents. Obviously, we have an election in the US, and I was wondering, how does the Electoral Commission actually deal with all that is thrown at them currently? Or we could be thinking about a state of origin and a halftime talk to the team. Now, these are all distinct short crises. It will be interesting to hear from two fantastic speakers today about leadership during times of crisis, where we now are actually in a crisis that has sort of an unlimited nature to it, an open end, very different. So we will go into the presentation shortly. If you have questions throughout these presentations to the speakers, you can always add these to the Q&A function below. We will ask these questions at the end of the two talks. So this afternoon, we're going to hear from Professor Matthew Hornsey and from Kathy Hilyard from KPMG, who I will now introduce to you. Professor Matthew Hornsey is a social psychologist at the University of Queensland Business School. He has published over 150 academic papers, mostly on the psychology of influence and persuasion. And for this, he has been appointed a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. He teaches the science of leading people and teams in the highly ranked MBA program at UQ. Kathy Hilyard leads KPMG's National Leadership Development Practice and is a partner in the People and Change practice. She has over 30 years experience working in and with organizations to design, review, and reform their leadership and performance practices and frameworks. Kathy has led many large-scale cultural reform programs, including leadership engagement and development, designed high-performance frameworks, and conducted organizational performance reviews in both the private and public sectors. Kathy is passionate about building high performance, resilience, and capability to enable leaders to modernize, reform, and continually adapt their leadership approach and practices to make a difference in their organization and the wider community. So we will now hear from Matthew, who will then hand over to Kathy. We will then reconvene for questions and answers after Kathy's presentation.
Thank you for that introduction, Michael. I have to say it's a little bit ironic and a little bit nerve-wracking, to be honest, holding forth here about leading organizations through crisis in front of my boss, who is literally leading my organization out of crisis as we speak. But that is my brief this evening. I'm going to be giving you 5 tips about how you can be the best leader you can possibly be of an organization during times of crisis. Let me just share my screen for a second. What I want to do is to specifically focus on the immediate aftermath of a black swan event. So the days, the weeks, maybe the few months immediately after these black swan events, by which I mean these events that blindside us, extreme, somewhat traumatic events that are very difficult to predict in advance. Now, obviously, COVID is the black swan event that is preoccupying us right now. And I know that Kathy later in this session is going to be talking about some of her learnings and reflections, watching organizations cope with the COVID crisis. But for both of us, I think our analysis is going to expand beyond that, because obviously this is the black swan event that's preoccupying us right now, but there's likely to be others around the corner And you only have to reflect on fairly recent history to see that. I know it's sort of difficult for me to remember 2019 because it feels like an eternity ago. But of course, there were the bushfires. The President of the United States got impeached. The Prime Minister of the UK resigned over Brexit. China and dissidents in Hong Kong were battling. There was a military strike from America to Iran in the Persian Gulf. So there's always something around the corner. And we no longer really live in an era of relative calm, punctuated by moments of crisis. It feels like in this highly globalized world, flux and disruption and crisis are a semi-permanent feature of the landscape. And on one level, that seems like that's bad news for leaders, because that's a lot of sleepless nights, that's a lot of exhaustion, that's a lot of tough decisions, which is true. But before I launch into my 5 tips, I just wanted to talk about a couple of pieces of good news for leaders in an era of crisis. And one of those is that in some ways, this is your chance to shine as a leader. You may have heard the cliche that true leadership is revealed in times of crisis. And that is a cliche because it's true. People are watching you, people are paying attention, and you're likely to discover parts of yourself that you didn't know you had. But the people around you are almost certain to discover parts of you that they didn't know you had. And so if you do even a passable job at steadying a ship during a time of crisis, you'll be rewarded with people's respect, with people's loyalty. The other piece of good news for leaders is that people really do want to believe in you. We saw this with COVID. In the immediate aftermath of COVID, there was a spike in trust in various institutions around the globe, and also a spike in trust among our political leaders. So this is a graph showing you the approval ratings of various global leaders in the immediate aftermath of the point at which the World Health Organization announced that this was a pandemic. And if you look closely at that x-axis, you can see that within the first week of this being declared as a pandemic, the approval ratings for every single leader went up, every single one. And this is fascinating to me because in that week, most leaders did not have a chance to prove their trustworthiness. They did not have a chance to prove their competence. But they get that bounce anyway. This is the rally around the flag effect, but just broadly, it's what I call motivated trust. And it will happen within leadership structures and organizations as well during times of crisis. It's almost like cynicism about leadership is a luxury that people have in times of relative calm. But in times of crisis, I just don't think people have a stomach to be cynical about leadership. They really want to believe. And it's in these types of crisis that what were previously loose communities of individuals, some of whom are disinterested, some of whom are cynical, some of whom are self-centered, some of whom are highly restless, they're now looking to you. And in those fleeting moments, they're united by that sense of followership. Now, for a couple of the leaders, you'll see that the bounce on approval tailed off after about 10 days and went into negative territory. And for a third of those global leaders, they may or may not have just lost an election. We're not sure yet. But the lesson here is that obviously a crisis does not give you amnesty in perpetuity. You'll be given that gift of trust. But obviously it's what you do with it that counts. And so that's really what I'll be doing today. I'm just going to be talking about 5 tips about how to not mess up when that spotlight is on you during a crisis. And the first tip, probably the most important tip, I think, is that this is not a time for you to be a hero. If you have this romantic notion that you can be the great beacon leading an organization out of the darkness, then you're probably stepping out in the wrong direction. And I do get it, I understand that. And in fact, you know, it's a romantic notion of leadership that I shared for a long time, which is that my model of leadership was there was one person who will single-handedly transform a situation, often through a combination of bravery and brilliance and charisma. And it's sort of aligned with this great person notion of leadership, the idea that leadership resides in the DNA and in the heart of great people. It's a romantic notion, and everyone's got their great leaders that they admire. But I think that this notion has always been a myth. First of all, ordinary people can be great leaders, which is a relief, right? Thank God for that, because by definition, most of us are average. By definition, most of us are ordinary. But I firmly believe that ordinary and average people can be great leaders. Second, the truth is that most crises are just too complex, they're too multifaceted, they're just too fast moving for any one individual, or even any one team really, to be able to canvass all the information it needs to make a good decision. You're not charging out the front. What you need to be doing is to be coordinating among networks of teams, because your HR folk and your finance folk and your sales folk and your supply chain folk and whoever it is, they all have access to a wealth of information that's at their coalface. And all of them need to be sharing information and doing it in a complex and fast-moving environment. And so this is what leadership looks like in times of crisis. It's very much distributed leadership. Leadership is distributed through many levels of the organization. It's the job of a network of teams. This is not heroic or romantic work. This is unglamorous. This is hard work, and it's humble work. And you see that in the literature on leadership. If you enroll in MBAs, or many of you already have, you would know that these notions of great person theories of leadership are very much out of fashion. All the language now is around humble leadership and servant leadership, followership, distributed leadership. It's a very different language of leadership. The second tip that I have is to effectively slow down. Weirdly, the first time I heard this tip was from a cricketer. I'm going to out myself now as a cricket tragic, but for the cricket tragics among the audience, some of you may remember a guy called Michael Bevan, who was a batsman. And Michael Bevan was famous for one-day cricket. This is not the slow 5-day version of cricket. This is the faster one-day version of cricket, where people have to score runs under huge time pressure. Okay, so it's about performing under pressure. And back in the 90s, there was no one better at scoring runs under pressure than Michael Bevan. He was famous for it. And I remember a journalist asking him once, what's your secret? How come you seem to be able to handle the pressure better than others? And he said, you have more time than you think. When you're stressed, you have more time than you think. And I always remembered that. And then I went on and studied psychology. And it turns out there's a scientific basis to this, because stress and pressure, adrenaline, does certain very predictable things to our mind, 2 very predictable things. And one of them is that our internal clock, the one that tells us how fast time is going, our internal clock malfunctions. And so time appears to be going faster than it really is. So if you think about a roller coaster where the adrenaline's going, many roller coasters only go for 30 or 40 seconds, but it feels like it goes for much longer than that. And I've actually been mindful of this recently, because I found myself reading my old diaries from when I was much younger. And I was reading about this very stressful period of my life. And what really shocked me was that in my memory, this period went for a month, but in reality, it only went for a week and a half. When you're under pressure, when the adrenaline's flowing, an hour can feel like a day can feel like a week can feel like a month. And the lesson is, it's the Michael Bevan lesson, right? That you probably have more time than you think. The other thing that happens when we're stressed is that it feels intolerable to not make a decision. It can be extremely anxiety provoking to do nothing. In the psychological research, they call this the need for cognitive closure, right? And the problem with this is that leaders, time and time again, preemptively and prematurely leap in with decisions, which in their mind, maybe they're construing as brave decisions or being decisive, but in reality may well just be people cracking under anxiety. It's a sign of people cracking under the pressure. You need to quiet that part of your brain that tells you you need to be doing something now, because during times of crisis, and probably during times of crisis as much as any other time, there's a virtue in being patient, and there's a virtue in waiting until all the information has landed and all the dust has settled before you make a decision. Our brain's going to try and trick us into racing ahead, and we have to try and tell it to slow down. Third tip is about communication. And this is really one non-negotiable part of being a leader during a time of crisis, is that you are a figurehead for information and for communication. So how do you communicate during times of crisis? Well, one thing is to do it frequently. Earlier I was saying, don't rush ahead prematurely with decisions. And I believe that. But the worst thing you can do as a leader is to go silent up to that point where you make a decision. Because a regular drumbeat of communication from your leader is remarkably reassuring for employees, even if it's just a regular email update. The other thing is your communication should be empathic. And I know this audience already understands that it's communication 101. Yes, your communication needs to be empathic. But in times of crisis, it's particularly important because crises imply human cost. People losing their jobs, people are having huge hits to their well-being. And people are looking for you to acknowledge and pay respect to that human cost, and in a really genuine way, not a perfunctory link to a well-being site or to a counseling clinic, but to really engage with that human cost. And I think by doing that, you win legitimacy and you communicate that you really get it. The third notion of communication is that it needs to be transparent. And by this, I effectively mean it just needs to be honest. I think sometimes in an effort to be reassuring, leaders make the mistake of standing up early and making heroic promises that everything's going to be okay. And that's I guess it's an understandable sugar hit that you might get as an employee, but if events overtake you and it turns out things aren't going to be okay, then people will feel easily betrayed. And so the goal is not to be making heroic promises. The goal is to be honest about what you know and to be honest about what you don't know and to be clear about what needs to be done to learn more. I think that type of honesty is what actually calms people down, not the heroic promises. Tip 4 is about communicating calm. And the literature is very clear on this, the literature on emotional contagion. Your emotional expressions as a leader ripple through a room. Your emotional expressions are viral. So if you're expressing anger, you're enabling other people to express anger. If you're expressing frustration, then you're going to increase the frustration levels around you. If you are behaving in a way that is thin-skinned, you're communicating that this is no longer a safe place where people can be honest with you and give you important feedback. Communicating calm, I think, is way more important. I said it's as important, but I think it's actually way more important than actually being calm. It's probably not realistic that you can be calm in every circumstance during a crisis, but I think it is realistic that you can communicate calm during a crisis. And that means not raising your voice and not talking over the top of people and not being thin-skinned in the face of criticism. Radiating calm goes a long way to communicating that you are in control. And you think about, it's probably been a while, right? But if you think about the last time you flew in an airplane, and when there's a strange noise or there's a lot of turbulence, what do? You look to the flight attendants. Right? And if they look like that everything's okay, if they're communicating calm, then my brain tells me I have nothing to worry about. So next time you're in a public context trying to communicate during a crisis, just channel those air stewards. Last tip, tip 5, avoid being tethered to pet theories or ideologies. This tip might seem a bit counterintuitive because there's a huge movement out there about authentic leadership, right? The notion that leaders need to be authentic. And that can mean a whole bunch of different things to a whole lot of different people. But for some people, what it implies is that you should take your principles and your philosophies and your ideologies about how finances should work or how economies should work or how organizations should be run. And you're very consistent in terms of applying that in your daily life, right? So consistency is key. Which sounds perfectly reasonable, but I would argue that during a crisis, during a black swan event, when the whole world changes under your feet, then being tethered to these ideologies, etc., can make you flat-footed. So by all means, communicate authenticity through your communication, honest and transparent communication, but maybe not so much by rigidly adhering to all your pet theories and philosophies and ideologies. What I'm talking about is more what in the literature they call adaptive leadership. Adaptive leadership puts a huge priority on pragmatic flexibility in the face of rapid change. And I think Scott Morrison here in Australia is probably an interesting example of that. He's a person who has a deep personal conviction and political, ideological conviction around fiscal conservatism, low deficits, and small government. But when the world tipped on its axis and implied a different type of response, he was nimble enough to pivot. You'll see I've got a picture of a chameleon on this slide, and I know when people get called a chameleon, it's often in a negative way, like it implies that they've been insincere or untrustworthy. But you have to remember, why does a chameleon change its colors in the first place? It's a survival trick, right? And they're really good at it. You know how long chameleons have been on the planet? 60 million years, way longer than we have, all right? We could learn something from the chameleons. Just before I move on, one little sidebar about ideology. This is what I'll finish up with. One huge temptation for organizations during times of crisis is to push through a strategic plan or an ideological agenda that they suspect would be unpalatable in a business as usual environment. So maybe it's a chance to do that unpopular restructure, or to casualize the workforce, or maybe to take away that entitlement that employees love. So the social theorists have a term for this, disaster capitalism, the notion that crises present corporations with an opportunity to push through an aggressive reform agenda. And I'm not going to get into the politics of that. This is not the forum for doing that. And plus I can see both sides of the politics of that. But if you're in that position and you're thinking about your organization, should you be using COVID as an opportunity to push forward some agenda that you've always wanted to push forward? I would say you just need to think very clearly and think very hard about how important trust and goodwill from your employees is for your organization. Because if that's not an important commodity, then by all means, I'd say go ahead and make those changes. But if it is, then I'd say think carefully about that. I'm not saying you can't make tough decisions. Of course, you're going to be making tough decisions. And that's okay, because the research shows that people are actually remarkably okay with difficult decisions if they trust that the motives behind those decisions are pure and reasonable. But if people suspect, if they even suspect you're taking advantage of a crisis to push forward an aggressive reform agenda, then you're going to lose the room very, very quickly. And I think all that goodwill that's been accumulated would be shredded in a microsecond. And so if you do care about staff goodwill and you care about employee trust, then I'd say a crisis is not the time to push forward a radical change management strategy. But anyway, enough of my editorializing. Here's a little summary of the things I've been talking about. Quite simple, really. Try not to be a hero, slow down, think about your communication strategy, radiate calm, and focus on pragmatic flexibility. I'm going to hand it over to Kathy now. He's going to pick up the conversation. So I look forward to hearing that. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments at the end of the session as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And a lot of what you've said there resonates very strongly with me. And there's some threads here that will, I think, reinforce and hopefully complement some of those points that you've made. I'm going to share my screen. And while I do, I just wanted to thank the University of Queensland for having us all here today. And also to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands we're meeting on. I'm coming to you here today from Ngunnawal country. So let me just set the scene a little bit. I want to think about a few things today around this idea of leading in disruption. And firstly, I'm thinking about, I'm just trying to get my screen to, here we go, to shift. Oh dear. Okay, let me try that. There we go. So really thinking about this whole idea of the context in which we're operating is one of disruption and complexity. And I think when we thinking about leadership, this idea that leadership is very context specific. So times of disruption and complexity require particular things of us as leaders, and we'll talk some more about that. And then I'm just going to dive into 5 lenses, if you like, on leadership. We seem to have a rule of 5s today. And one, the first is around ourselves as leaders in times of disruption and complexity. The second is around the notion, and Matthew did touch on this a little bit, I think, the idea of collective leadership and why that's so important in the times we're in. I want to think a little bit about the role of leaders in creating and building trust in our organisations and institutions, and particularly contextualise that in this post-COVID world that we're in. And then a couple of tips from me around the whole idea of high performance and resilience for us as leaders, and how complexity and disruption is impacting on those factors that we need to pay attention to. So the quote here, I think is a really important quote that sort of sets the tone here, because I'm a really big advocate of thinking about leaders being great analysts of the environment that they're operating in and really making conscious choices about their responses to that environment, both at the organisational level, so in thinking about how the organisation is responding and reacting to the factors that are shaping its market, its social environment, its the wider economy and so on, but also being analysts of how those contextual factors are impacting on you personally as a leader and your responses and reactions. So something to think about here, the context is a really important feature of our work as leaders, and being context savvy is something we talk about a lot. And if you're in public sector organisations, that includes being, you know, really tuned to the political and policy drivers of the times you're in. So let's head into our first discussion of context. So I've been thinking, I think Matthew sort of touched on this as well, but it's clear to me that there's different ways to think about crisis, and the COVID and the last 12 months, in fact, you know, have really got me thinking about this idea that there's certain types of leadership required when we're in the height of the crisis. And if we take COVID or even the bushfires, you know, we are in those times, we're sort of reacting to the environment, trying to make rapid decisions that are well considered. We're responding to emergent factors. And what we noticed in COVID, I think, was that we were very much focused on connecting. I know a lot of my clients were really giving a lot of thought to how do we keep people connected? How do we keep people motivated, productive, and how do we make sure that everybody's okay in this, you know, uncertain and ambiguous situation that's just sort of landed on us. And then we sort of moved into, and I know, you know, there'll be people here from Victoria today, and this first emergence, you know, seems like a long time ago, I'm sure, for those of you who are just exercising some freedoms that have been lost to you for some months. But that first emergence, and I remember running a webinar back in it would have been July, and talking about, you know, our new reality now that we're post-COVID, and now that seems a bit silly, really. So we're coming out in that first emergence, reflecting, what can we learn, what can we take forward. We've had a massive shift, for example, to virtual working in that early days of the first lockdowns, And, you know, people were saying, well, we've learned all about virtual working. We'll keep that and we'll let go of some other things, wondering what's coming at us next, you know, rethinking our new normal, those sorts of things. And now we're sort of moving again into what I'm thinking of is a realization that this is, as Matthew talked about, it's a long haul, not a single incident. So we're in uncharted territory a little bit, I think, because this disruptive, you know, zone is our new normal. And we've got, you know, we've had bushfires, we've had hailstorms, we've had floods, we've had the COVID, we've had the economic crisis coming off COVID. I was talking to a Queenslander this morning who was telling me, you know, there's a forecast for 4 cyclones for this summer for Queensland. We've got US elections going on. You know, all of these things are combining to create a fair degree of, you know, uncertainty and disequilibrium. And so that's having an impact at emotional level for people. People are tired. People are starting to feel, you know, we're hearing lots of conversations about, oh, I just hope this summer I can just have a break. I can't wait till the end of the year, you know, all of those kind of things. So there's a reality here of, you know, impacts on people's resilience and so on. And I think from a leadership perspective, you know, we have to be really conscious in this period of getting the balance right between trying to create hope. And I notice the Napoleonic picture on Matthew's first slide, and that whole idea of Napoleon as leaders are dealers in hope. Well, we actually have to exercise a little bit of pragmatism in that at the moment, and just this idea of thinking about how do we acknowledge the uncertainty and make sure that we're engaging people in ways that aren't, you know, where we're not tempted to fall into reassuring people that it all will be okay, which is probably a common thing that the hero leader kind of concept is really all about. I've got this, I'll take you, I'm the hero, follow me. We're really in a different world now where we're trying to engage with people in what I'm calling pragmatic optimism in the new reality. So, so that's a little bit about the context we're operating in, this kind of disruptive, multi-layered, you know, crises or post-crises status. I want to turn to thinking about the self in context, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but as leaders in complexity, we really need to stop and pause every now and again and think about this question. Who are the leaders we need to be to shape and steer our organisations in these turbulent times? And I think more than ever, we need to be reflective of some of the habits, the mindsets, even the skills that we have developed over time that have served us well, maybe for many years or maybe, you know, more recently, and ask these questions about, are these still serving us well in the times we're in the context that we're now operating in? And these ideas around, you know, being able to unlearn some of those habits, mindsets, and relearn, to make space to relearn new approaches is really important. And we talk about this in 3 ways. So we need to think about what's the mindset we need to adopt in complexity. And it's really about curiosity and being purpose-driven and being interested in the views and perspectives of others and being adaptive, as Matthew talked about. And then there's some skill sets that go with that, which are emerging around being facilitators of networks and deeply understanding the networks and how they're operating and how people are responding in them, and being able to facilitate people through conflict and ambiguity. And then a very important piece in the puzzle, I think, and really ascending as a very important concept, is this idea of your capacity as a leader. How are you managing your own recovery and performance and well-being so that you can be the leader you need to be in the crisis. I know myself that, you know, there are weeks when I'm very on point with this, and I'm making sure I get outside and get my exercise and eat well and sleep well. And I have my Calm app, and Matthew McConaughey reads me a story to bed at night. And then there's other weeks where I just am working late into the night and sending emails at all hours and a little bit out of control because I'm thinking I don't have as much time as I probably do, to take Matthew's point. So capacity is a really important issue, and we think, you know, for leaders to be effective, you really have to. It's a bit like on the plane taking the oxygen mask first, you know, and really looking after yourself, because you need to role model that capacity to pay attention to well-being. I want to touch quickly on this idea of why it's important that we start to think about collective effort, and this is really building on Matthew's point about the hero, the death of the hero leader. You know, I see a lot of organisations, executive teams, still thinking they're doing leadership when really what they're doing is managing the organisation to within an inch of its life. So we're talking about controls, and I think about really practical things like your executive leadership meetings or your own team leadership meetings. What's the content of those conversations? What's the process you're using to have those conversations? And if you're like a lot of my client organisations, I see executive teams getting together and putting way too many agenda items on a full day program of talks with unsuspecting people coming in and running a PowerPoint presentation and items being ticked off lists. This is not leading in the way that I'm thinking about it. That's probably managing the organisation. So where's the time for the curious conversations about our people, our purpose, our context, our collective leadership? You know, how are we leading the organisation together to go forward, and how are we mobilising the networks of teams to align to deliver the results and to chart the course through the uncertainty? So this idea of collective leadership is something that's a really important issue, I think, in times of disruption. And I love Taleb's quote here, because the enemy of collective leadership is probably complacency, that we just think we can keep rolling out the same decisions and it'll be okay. Maybe we need to pause and think a bit more about how we're leading together. That brings me to this idea of trust. And I think out of the crisis, what we've been seeing is lots of organisations responding in ways that have really built trust. And you can think about, you know, from first responders in the fires through to, you know, banks giving people respite from their mortgage payments, through to, you know, decisions by government around JobKeeper and JobMaker and JobSeeker and all of those job cluster of things to try and make sure that people are taken care of. There's a social good kind of dimension to this. And I think increasingly we're going to see stakeholders expecting not just that organisations have integrity, are competent and have my interests at heart, but that they share value as a social good, so that they are responsible and contributing to the broader well-being of the society. And we'll see, I think, more and more of an expectation of both customers and shareholders and stakeholders more generally in thinking along those lines. And the work of building trust is, the heavy lifting is done by leaders. And we think about this as leaders, we need to be in crisis and post, you know, as we're in these disruptive environments, thinking really clearly about the purpose and the promise that we're making as an organisation to our stakeholders. Why are we here, and what are we saying we will deliver? And is our reputation aligned to that purpose and promise? not just window dressing, but actually are we delivering, and are we perceived as delivering on the promise that we are making? And behind the scenes, internally, does our culture enable us to meet the promise and to deliver on the reputational factors that we are that our stakeholders expect? And so, you know, these three things, leaders have a role in crafting and communicating purpose and promise. They have a role in keeping very well tuned to the external stakeholder world, and then also not being hijacked by particular stakeholder groups at the expense of others. And we do a lot of work with, we have our UQ academic partner, Nicole Gillespie, who has written extensively and helps us with this thinking at KPMG. And then this work of leaders to be the stewards of culture. And these are the times, I think, when we really have to, as leaders, with everything that's going on, be really focused on this trustworthiness building, both personally and organisationally. So a couple more slides to go, and I'll finish. But I said the fourth kind of theme that I wanted to pick up was how do we? A lot of our clients are talking to us about how do we make sure we're productive and we've got people performing when we're in these hybrid workplaces now, where people are working from all kinds of, you know, they're working from home, or they might be working in the office, or they might be making choices about when they're working where, and we can't see people anymore, and all of those things. And if you think back to the start of the COVID crisis, I was having lots of conversations with people about how are we going to measure productivity through this? How am I going to know what people are doing when they're not in front of me? But interestingly, most organisations are now reporting a very different problem, which is around, we've been highly productive. We've been more productive through COVID and this period than ever before. But now what we're worrying about is the sustainability of that. And I know, and I think there's a few people from my team on this call today. I know in our team of people, there's definitely some fatigue setting in around how fast we've been running and how much work we've been doing, and all of us feeling very lucky and privileged to be in that situation, to have work and to have meaningful work at that. But at the same time, there's got to be a sustainability consideration here. So in these times, I think it's a huge opportunity for us to disrupt our approaches, our 50-year-old outdated approaches to managing performance, and start to shift the dial to thinking about this idea of leading for performance. And some ideas here grounded in social psychology, in this way of thinking, actually, around how do we create an environment that actually enables people to do their best work, rather than thinking about how do we put controls in place to manage the productivity of people. It's a pretty outdated concept now, and we're moving into, you know, a very different world. And this slide describes a few of the factors that leaders can focus in on to think, where will I channel my effort? What might be going on right now in my team, in my organisation, that would allow me to unleash the potential? So is it that I could be clearer, we could be clearer about changing expectations? Is it that we could be clearer with people about how well we think they're performing? Have we got people motivated and aligned to the new world of work and the new expectations? Are they motivated to do the work we're asking of them? Have we got the infrastructure right? Is there trust? Do people want to help them succeed? And, you know, questions like, have we got the capability and capacity to deliver performance? And you know, in the times we're in, we talk a lot about these new capabilities emerging around, you know, dynamic capabilities, the ability to flex and adapt and be digitally savvy, but make strategic decisions in the midst of uncertainty and ambiguity, all those kind of emergent capabilities that help us build adaptive organisations. So this idea of leading for performance is something I think we need to be paying attention to as leaders, and being diagnostic about the factors that we might be able to attend to ensure that people are enabled to do their best work. And finally, and probably most importantly, this idea of, as leaders, paying attention to our own resilience and the resilience of our organisations. And I think just to pull that together, you know, the idea that we're not in it alone, that we are in it together, we're operating as a collective, can be a very reassuring and helpful thing to know that you've got each other's back and you're able to shape the future together rather than alone. We are needing to be the chameleon, as Matthew said, and you know, I think I like Taleb's idea of anti-fragility here, that we don't just kind of fall and bounce back, but in anti-fragility, we're thinking we've been through this dark place together. We're deeply reflecting on what we've learned and the insights and what we need to do differently, and we actively change and move forward differently. I think this is now something we're having to do, you know, more regularly and at scale across our organisations, and build that ability to do that deep learning and the unlearning and so on as part of our DNA of our organisations. And I've talked about the others. I think I'll just touch on this last one. Really, I think this whole idea of us needing to be able to reset our boundaries and ensure that we are investing time in our personal recovery. And many people are talking to me about that, you know, that idea. Are we working from home or are we living at work? You know, those sorts of questions. And how do we make sure that we as leaders and our people are setting realistic and sustainable boundaries around the concept of work and rest of life? We might be enjoying the productivity benefits of that for now, but for how long if we don't really start to focus on boundary setting and communicating our boundaries, and for that to be an acceptable thing to do. So I'm going to stop there. I'm hoping that's covered some ground that's of some use to everybody, and I'll say thank you, and maybe go back to Michael, I think, for questions.
Yes, thank you very much, both our speakers. Those were fantastic and insightful presentations. Of course, very interesting to look in both a theoretical and a practical perspective on leadership in a time of crisis. So we've got a number of questions already out there, and I would encourage people on the call to keep adding to this. And I'm just going to try to pick a number of these and maybe add a little bit of my own spin onto that. I mean, one really interesting one, and Matthew, I want to start with you on this, and I'm paraphrasing one of the questions that was being asked here. The leadership attributes and these tips that you've essentially presented there, if you look at some of the leaders that we have in quite powerful political countries out there, they're not using any of those tips, and yet they at least get close to being re-elected, or potentially even re-elected. What's going on here? Why is that? Why are those tips that you have there really, really good for a leader, yet we're observing these different behaviors out there?
I actually think that the art of being a politician these days is really around communication, and the art of communicating empathy and communicating authenticity. And you look at somebody who's famous for this, Jacinda Ardern. I mean, she does have a strong communications background, and it really shows in the way she has communicated around the crisis. I would actually say that most leaders are probably innately quite skilled at communication around this. The trick is that, of course, we're all binge watching America right now, and we've got a very, very dramatic example of somebody who didn't obey these tips. And And, I think Trump sits in a parallel kind of category, but we have to remember that the world is much larger than that. Some of the people talking in the Q&A session were raising the notion of echo chambers and the polarization of society. And I made the same point about that we look at America and we see how polarization is being weaponized. And I was shocked. But I have to say, in some ways, not surprised when COVID got drawn into the culture wars in America. And it started, becoming part of the defining values of what differentiated liberals and conservatives. And at that point, information and evidence and expertise started to fall by the wayside. And we did see that happen in 1 or 2 countries, maybe Brazil, maybe Spain. But I have to say that is a rarity. I think one of the nice things about crises, if it's not crass to say that, but one of the upsides is that these external shocks to the system do have a habit of bringing people together and harmonizing people. And in some ways, the schisms, the fault lines in society are a luxury that a nation can have when they're not facing these enormous external shocks. So I'm actually slightly more upbeat about the global scene than maybe some others.
Okay, fantastic. And Kathy, maybe one for you. You emphasized the point of looking after yourself as a leader. And in a way that sort of resonates with what Matthew was talking about, don't be a hero, or you don't need to be a hero. And there's a question there talking about this heavy lifting of leaders and their role there, which is sort of going in the direction of actually trying to be the hero and not looking after yourself. Now, in that question, the question was not taking expert advice into account, essentially not bringing the team into this. Would be interesting to hear your comments. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think it is important to not confuse heavy lifting with being the hero, and they are quite different things, I think. But maybe the heavy lifting around this, and I agree that the issue in complexity with leadership and expertise, I think, is about harnessing the range of different expertise that you might need to bring to a complex challenge, rather than just so there's the skill of leaders of listening, of facilitating disparate views, because complex challenges are often not solved with one form of expertise. They need multiple perspectives, and so the art of leadership becomes the navigation of the different views and perspectives and the creation of novel solutions that may not have emerged from a single expert. So I think we absolutely have to be able to harness expertise, but maybe the way we're doing the heavy lifting is more as the facilitators and the navigators of conflict that might be intrapersonal and interpersonal, in order to get really different and new solutions. So that's maybe one way to look at what I'm thinking about as heavy lifting.
Does that connect to the point that you were trying to make, that the in leadership you need to make room for the right conversations in executive teams and so on, and not so much focus on the nitty-gritty detail and inviting lots of PowerPoint people, but actually creating the room for those type of conversations?
There's often not a lot of, you're making space for people to explore, to sense, to frame a problem well, to understand the nature of a situation that we're trying to resolve, rather than rolling through, sort of giving permission to people to get on with work, I guess is the way that I'm thinking about it.
Okay.
But you need a bit of both, right? You need both, but being conscious about where we're investing our time. I know during sort of the last few months, we've heard a lot about boards operating quite differently, of having shorter lead-in times and shorter papers to consider, and more, more deep deep reflection of what's going on and how to respond, rather than months of papers being developed and then, you know, consideration, you know, in a long meeting on, you know, quarterly and so on. So it's a different pace and cadence that I'm thinking about.
Thanks, Kathy. Jumping to a different point, and Matthew, I think this one would be interesting for you. There was a question earlier where Simon was talking about a world, a post-truth world that has is more and more divided within echo chambers, where we're actually just listening to the information that we believe in. It's probably going slightly back to something that we discussed earlier. But the question is here, how can networks of teams work together when critical linkages are damaged? How does our resilience, where does our resilience come from now?
Yeah, I mean, it does in some ways feed back to the point I was making. I understand that there's been a collapse of trust in many institutions. There is growing polarization. People are curating their own reality by exposing themselves to echo chambers on social media, etc. And these are huge problems in society. But my read of it, if you look at COVID as an example, and it's not the only example, but when humans are faced with these external threats, that we see a transformation in the way humans orient towards each other. And so you do see this kind of rally around the flag of faith. You see this motivated trust. The evidence is really dramatic around this, that tailing off of trust in institutions around the world rebounded after COVID. And you saw the faith that people were putting into politicians that they previously had been skeptical about. And we see these very polarized societies that are fighting amongst each other unite. And actually, to me, the headline story of COVID, if you look away from the TV and you stop focusing on America, the headline story of COVID is the ability of humans to look after each other and to coordinate and to cooperate and to sacrifice for a greater cause. That, to me, I think is going to be the legacy of this. And I think that can happen within nations, but it can also happen with organizations, where you see the petty politics within organizations that evaporate. When they're actually faced, the heat is on, they're actually faced with an objective crisis.
That's a really good point. And there was earlier somebody asked about this graph that you showed in there in the sense of actually measuring approval. And I want to take that question in a slightly different direction than it was originally asked. I mean, as a leader, you actually want to know how well you are doing. And there's a lot of leaders out there who have difficulty actually trusting themselves in these processes. And it does connect back to the question of looking after yourself as well in this process. So what tools do you have as a leader to essentially evaluate how well you're doing?
Yeah, that's interesting, because most of us don't have the luxury of political polls to be able to tell us how well we're doing. And so that's where it comes around to, I mean, Kathy spoke a lot about culture, but to me, the number one cultural imperative is to create psychological safety within an organization where people feel as though they have permission to give you feedback, to deliver bad news, to criticize you if need be. And for me as a leader, that's incredibly reassuring. If I feel as though people are able to be honest with me, then that's extremely reassuring, because I'm getting an accurate gauge. And without an accurate gauge of your performance, you've got nothing. Like nothing but paranoia or hubris, right? And so I think that's partly in your control as a leader. You can create a tone where people feel as though they've got that safety, or you can subtly discourage people from giving you that feedback.
Okay, thank you. I want to take one last question from the group here, and here's one for Kathy, which I liked. As part of leadership resilience, what is your experience on personal discovery during a crisis? Does this discovery happen naturally, or what tips do you have to start this personal unlearning and relearning, picking up on what you were talking about here?
It's a great question, and I'm doing a lot of work on this right at the moment around working with leaders to help them consciously create culture that has psychological safety, that is collaborative, that is working more collectively, those kind of things, depending on the organisation. And what we're trying to do to support that that unlearning and relearning that has to go on is really starting with some deep personal reflection. So we start with this idea of it's all about me, and then we move to it's all about us, and then we move to it's all about performance. So we're asking people to reflect on their values, their assumptions, to be conscious of their biases, to be aware of what we talk about micro moves, the moment that you might have had with somebody where there was a response you gave that may have made them feel dismissed or less able to give the feedback, Matthew, or whatever it was, and being aware of those micro moves and addressing them. So it's, the short answer is deep reflection, and then some really hard work on habit changing. And we know around, really thinking about what are some of the ways that what's that habit that I may have adopted because of some assumptions and some armor that I wear or whatever it might be that isn't serving me well in this new environment, and working on identifying the habit, identifying the alternative behavior, and then thinking about some of the rewards, the intrinsic rewards that might go with achieving a change. So it's hard work. It's actually hard work, unlearning. It's painful, but I think essential. So we need help with it. Don't do it alone. It's not for the faint-hearted. Don't
do it alone, I think is a good comment here. We triggered quite a bit of interest here. Unfortunately, I have to wrap it up, and the discussion was triggering more and more questions. But I want to thank both of you for your presentations and being here. I want to thank our guests coming on board and listening in. And I specifically want to thank KPMG for partnering with the business school on this thought leadership webinar. If this webinar sparked your interest in furthering your education and leadership skills, we would encourage you to look into our MBA program. You will see on your screens, we have an upcoming information webinar on the 10th of November for our #1 ranked MBA program. And for those alumni in the audience, this message is specifically relevant for you. Did you know you can leverage the power of the UQ Alumni Network? With over 290,000 alumni spanning various industries and countries, UQ now has an online alumni-to-alumni flash mentoring platform, helping you to connect with your global alumni community. As an exclusive UQ mentoring and peer coaching platform, UQ A2A, or alumni-to-alumni program, will help you connect and share learnings and career development opportunities with other professionals. The platform lets alumni search and, with permission, swap contact information to have short, tactical conversations or build ongoing relationships. You can sign up by accessing the link on this slide. So thank you again for joining us, everybody. And a short poll will pop up on your screens so that you can let us know if you enjoyed the event, what other events you may be interested in. Thank you very much. Take care and all the best.